Picture this. It is 2 in the morning. You are lying on the ground in the dark, somewhere in a forest in Germania that no Roman has ever mapped. The trees above you are so dense you cannot see the stars. The ground beneath you is frozen mud. Your wool blanket is soaked through. Your armor is stacked next to you. Not because you've been told to remove it, but because if you sleep in it, the cold metal will pull the heat from your body, and you will not wake up. The man beside you, close enough that you can feel his breath, is a stranger you've known for 4 years. He is the only reason you slept at all tonight, because the rule is simple. If you close your eyes out here, someone stays awake. And if nobody does, if exhaustion wins, you may not see the dawn. This is not a story about battles. It is not a story about emperors, or legions, or the glory of Rome. This is a story about the hours between the fighting, the hours that history forgot to record, the hours that history forgot to record, the hours that were, in many ways, more terrifying than anything that happened on the battlefield. Because the battlefield, at least, was something you could see. The night was something else entirely. Most people, when they think of, the Roman army, imagine the daylight version, the formations, the eagles, the discipline, the red cloaks and the gleaming shields, and the mechanical, grinding efficiency of the most successful military machine the ancient world ever produced. And all of that is real. All of that happened. But what happened after the march ended, when the light died, and the orders stopped coming, that is a story that almost no one tells. Welcome to Echoes of Suffering, where we go to the places history left dark. Let's begin with something that seems almost too basic to matter. Where did a Roman soldier actually sleep? The answer, for most of a soldier's career, was a leather tent. Not a large one, not a comfortable one. A tent roughly the size of a modern bathroom called a contubernium tent, shared between 8 men. 8 grown men who had marched 20 miles that day, possibly in full armor, possibly in summer heat or driving autumn rain, carrying packs that weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. 8 men who stank of sweat and leather and smoke and blood in various combinations, depending on what kind of day it had been. 8 men who were now expected to sleep, side by side, in a space, so confined that turning over without disturbing the man next to you was a kind of art. The tent itself was made from goatskin. Specifically, it took the skins of roughly 10 goats to make a single contubernium tent. When new, it was relatively watertight. But these tents were not new. They were marched with, repaired, patched, repatched, and carried on muleback until the leather cracked and the stitching rotted, and the waterproofing that the skin had naturally provided was long gone. On a wet night in Britannia, or on the Rhine frontier, and there were many, many wet nights in Britannia, and on the Rhine, sleeping inside that tent meant sleeping inside something that wept water through every seam. The weight of that tent, when wet, was extraordinary. Historians estimate that a saturated goatskin tent could weigh close to 100 pounds. The men who carried it, because in the Roman army, everything was carried by the men, called it by a nickname that translates roughly as the beast, not affectionately. But here is what you need to understand about the tent, and about everything else in a Roman soldier's sleeping arrangements, before we go any further. The tent was not what made the night survivable. The tent was just canvas or leather between you and the open sky. What made the night survivable was the contubernium itself, the 8 men inside it. The word contubernium is fascinating if you follow it to its root. It comes from taberna, a shelter, a hut, a booth, but the prefix con means together. So a contubernium is literally a sharing of shelter, and in the Roman army, the 8 men of a contubernium were the basic unit of everything. They marched together, they cooked together, they built camp together. They built camp together, they stood watch together, and they slept together in every sense of the word that matters for survival, if not in the sense that makes you raise an eyebrow. These were your 8 men, your world, reduced to 8 men. They knew your nightmares because they heard them. They knew which of you slept light, and which slept like the dead. They knew who cried out in his sleep after a bad battle, and who lay so still in the mornings you sometimes had to watch his chest to be sure he was breathing. They knew the exact amount of space each of you needed, and when that space shrank because someone's joints had swollen from the cold, they adjusted without being told. After 4 years on campaign together, and a standard enlistment was 25 years, these 8 men were not your friends. They were something beyond that. They were the people who existed inside your sleep. Now, the camp itself, because the Roman soldier did not simply find a field and lie down in it. What happened every single evening on a Roman campaign was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary feats of organized labor in military history. And it happened whether the army had just fought a pitched battle that day, or had merely marched. It happened whether they were exhausted beyond coherent thought, or fresh from a rest day. It happened in summer and winter and rain and darkness. Every single night, the Romans built a camp, not a rough camp, not a circle of fires with men sleeping around the edges. A proper fortified encampment, a castra with a perimeter ditch, an earthen rampart, a wooden palisade on top of the rampart, 4 gates, an internal road grid, designated areas for the legionary commander, for the cavalry, for the supply wagons, for the medical facilities, for the latrines, and for the rows of leather tents arranged in precise miles. Sure. Military order. All of it built from scratch. Every evening, before they ate. The tools to build this camp were part of what every Roman soldier carried on his back. The famous furca, the forked carrying pole that gave soldiers their nickname, Marius's mules, after the general who standardized the load, held not just the soldier's personal kit, but his section of the digging tools. Each contubernium of 8 men collectively carried the equipment needed to dig their section of the perimeter ditch, drive their stakes for the palisade, and erect their tent. The stakes pila muralia, sharpened on both ends to be interlocked along the top of the rampart, were each soldier's personal responsibility. You lost your stakes, you answered for it, loudly. The ditch itself was typically 3 feet wide and 3 feet deep on a standard marching camp. On longer-term positions it went deeper, sometimes to 10 feet, sometimes with additional obstacles at the bottom, sharpened stakes, thorn branches, concealed pits called lilia, named, with grim Roman humor, after the lilies their shape suggested. These were not defensive measures that made soldiers feel safe. They were the things that let ears become unconscious, which is a different thing entirely. Think about what that actually meant. You have marched since before dawn. You are carrying 60 pounds. It is now late afternoon, or perhaps early evening, and you have arrived at tonight's position, a flat piece of ground your surveyors chose this morning, before the army moved, because Roman armies sent men ahead to find and mark each night's campsite, which is itself an almost incomprehensible level of logistical sophistication. You are told to dig. So you dig, in your armor, with tools you've been carrying all day, alongside 7 men who are as exhausted as you are. You dig a trench, and throw up an earthwork, and drive stakes into the rampart top, and then and only then, when the perimeter is secured, when the sentries are posted, when the watchword for the night has been distributed, do you eat. And then, finally, you sleep. Except that is not quite right either, because sleep in a Roman military camp was not simply the absence of waking. It was a structured, managed, militarized process. The night was divided into 4 watches, the vigiliae, each roughly 3 hours long, rotating through the entire camp in sequence. UNCE. Every contubernium provided men for the watch. Every gate had sentries. Every section of the perimeter had a patrol. The watchword was checked by a mounted officer, who circulated the camp throughout the night, collecting wooden tablets from each sentry post, as proof the watch had been carried out. If a sentry was found asleep at his post, the punishment was immediate and brutal. His fellow soldiers beat him to death with wooden clubs and stones. Not as an excess of cruelty, as policy, because a sleeping sentry was a dead sentry. So of your 8 men in that tent on any given night, at minimum 1 or 2 were not sleeping. They were standing in the dark with a spear, watching the blackness beyond the palisade, listening for the sounds that did not belong to the forest, trying not to think about what was out there. And things were out there. In Germania, the forest beyond the Roman perimeter was not empty. The Germanic tribes understood the Roman camp had been watching them build it for generations by the time of the late Republic and early Empire. They knew that the Romans would camp, and they knew roughly where, because the Romans were predictable, which was both their group, elitist military strength and, in the dark, a genuine vulnerability. Ambushes on Roman camps were rare but real. The destruction of Varus's legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, 3 entire legions, perhaps 20,000 men, wiped out in 3 days of ambush, happened in part because the legions were strung out on the march and unable to form proper camp. The lesson was not lost. After Teutoburg, the camp discipline that had always been strict became almost religious in its rigidity. You built the camp because the alternative was what happened to Varus, But discipline and fortification could only do so much against the particular terror of night in a hostile landscape. And this is the part of the story that the military manuals and the campaign histories almost never address directly. What the knights felt like. Roman soldiers were not, as a category, men selected for psychological fortitude. They were selected for physical durability, for the ability to march and dig and obey orders. They came from farms and provincial towns. Many of them had never left their home region before enlisting. The man from a village in Hispania who found himself, at age 18, standing watch, at 2 in the morning on the Rhine frontier with the Germanic forest pressing in from the far bank. That man's internal experience of that moment was not the experience of a hardened professional warrior. It was the experience of a young man very far from home in absolute darkness, holding a spear, listening to sounds he could not identify. The Romans had a word for the kind of panic that could spread through a camp at night from no discernible cause. They called it tumultus nocturnae, nocturnal alarm. It happened more often than the official histories admit. A sound in the darkness, an animal, a branch falling, a sentinel's imagination given physical form by exhaustion, and suddenly men were grabbing weapons, shouting, the camp lurching toward chaos before officers could restore order. Sometimes men were killed in these panics by their own comrades. In the dark, the password screamed too late or not at all. Sleep, in this environment, was not rest in any simple sense. It was a discipline. You trained yourself to sleep the way you trained yourself to sleep the way you trained yourself to hold the line because you had to. Because the alternative was a kind of unraveling that the army could not afford, and that your 8 men could not carry. You closed your eyes in a leather tent that smelled of 8 bodies and wet goatskin with the sounds of the camp around you, the sentries calling the watch, the animals shifting, the distant fires, and you made yourself disappear into unconsciousness for however many hours you had before it was your turn at the wall. And then the nightmare, not a metaphor, an actual nightmare. The clinical reality of what extended military campaigning does to human sleep is something that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to fully document, but the Romans experienced it without any framework to understand it, and without any word for what we now call post-traumatic stress. What they had was the experience. Men who woke screaming, men who could not sleep, even when their watch was over. Men who went still and distant during the day in ways that made their contubernium mates watch them carefully. The Roman medical writer Galen describes soldiers suffering from disturbing dreams, so regularly that it reads, 2,000 years later, as a clinical account of combat trauma. The army's response to this was not compassion. The army's response was discipline, routine, the relentless forward motion of the campaign. You marched, you dug, you watched, you slept. You rose before dawn when the trumpet sounded the classicum, the reveille call, and you began again. The routine was not cruelty. The routine was not cruelty. The routine was the mechanism by which men who had seen terrible things were kept functional enough to see more terrible things. It was the only therapy the ancient world had to offer. There is a document that survives from Roman Egypt, a military papyrus, that records the daily duty roster of a small Roman garrison. On it, written in a clerk's hand in the flat bureaucratic Latin of military administration, are the sleeping assignments, the watch rotations, the names of men assigned to various duties for each day of the week. It is the most ordinary document imaginable. Reading it, you can feel the weight of what it represents, a system so complete, so all-encompassing, that even the act of sleeping was administered. You slept when the roster said you slept. When the roster said you slept. You woke when the trumpet said you woke. Your unconsciousness was scheduled. That papyrus survives. The men on it do not. In winter quarters, the situation changed, but did not necessarily improve. Roman army built permanent winter camps, hiberna, typically in fortified positions along the frontiers. These were stone or timber constructions, barracks buildings with actual walls and roofs. The contubernium still slept together, still 8 men to a room, but the room now had a hearth, or what passed for a hearth, a central fire, or a hypocaust system in the more elaborate frontier fortifications. The heat was real, but its distribution was not even. The men whose beds were closest to the heat slept in reasonable warmth. The men furthest from it, in a room that was essentially a stone box with narrow window slits, designed to minimize exposure to siege weapons, slept in cold that settled into the joints like a permanent visitor. The beds themselves were wooden frames strung with leather straps or rope, supporting a straw mattress that was restuffed. In theory, annually. In practice, restuffing happened when it happened, which meant that some soldiers slept on mattresses that had compressed to near solid density. The straw inside no longer distinguishable as individual stalks, but fused by years of body weight into something closer to felt. They covered themselves with their literary cloaks, the sagum, or the heavier pinula, and with whatever personal blankets they had acquired through legitimate means or otherwise. Boots stayed on in winter. This is a detail that appears in multiple sources, and that says something profound about the conditions. Not on the feet necessarily, though sometimes yes, but within reach, within arm's length, because boots in genuinely cold conditions will freeze if left too far from a body's heat, and frozen boots in the morning are boots you cannot get onto feet that need to march. The soldier who forgot this lesson learned it once. And then there was the question of what men did with the space between lying down and sleeping. This is the part that military history finds least interesting, and that I find most human. Because those hours, the ones after the watch was set, and before exhaustion pulled you under, were the hours in which the contubernium existed as something other than a military unit. Those were the hours for the conversations that happened in darkness. The ones about home, about the people left behind, about what you would do when the enlistment ended in 15 more years, about the battle 3 weeks ago, and the man from the 3rd contubernium who did not come back from it, whose name nobody had said aloud since. Roman soldiers wrote letters. We know this because some of them survive papyri found in the dry sand of Egypt, in the waterlogged darkness of Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall. They are remarkable documents. They are written in a Latin that is nothing like Cicero rough, practical, immediate. They ask for socks. They ask for food. One soldier writes to his mother asking her to send him something, anything, because conditions on the frontier are harder than he expected, and he misses her. He does not say it in those words. He says it in the words of a man who has been trained not to say such things, which means he says it sideways, around the edges, in the spaces between the practical requests. But it is there. Those letters were written, many of them, in the hours of that darkness, by lamplight, if you had lamp oil, by the fading glow of a fire if you didn't, with a stylus on a wax tablet if you were sending something short, or on papyrus if you were sending something that mattered, something you wanted to survive the journey. The ones that survive did survive. Most didn't. Most were read and lost and rotted in the soil of wherever the recipient lived, a village in Syria, a town in Gaul, a farm in Britain that has long since disappeared beneath fields or roads or cities. The soldiers who wrote them are entirely gone. We do not know most of their names. We do not know most of their names. We do not know what happened to them in the end, whether they made it through 25 years and walked away with their discharge certificate and their plot of land in some provincial settlement, or whether they did not. What we know is that they lay in the dark. What we know is that they lay in the dark and wrote letters to people they missed. And then they put the letters away and closed their eyes and tried to sleep through whatever the night brought. And in the morning they got up and strapped on their armor and marched again. The Roman army conquered roughly 5 million square kilometers of territory at its height. It garrisoned frontiers stretching from Scotland to the Euphrates. It maintained this for centuries. And the mechanism by which it did so, the true mechanism, beneath all the grand strategy and political maneuvering, was this: 8 men in a leather tent, sleeping in shifts, keeping each other alive through the dark. Not glory, not empire. 8 men and a goatskin tent, and the discipline to close your eyes and trust the man on watch. That is what built Rome. And here is the thing about that, the thing that sits with me and won't let go. Every marble monument, every triumphal arch, every grand inscription that begins Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome, was built on the back of men who slept on frozen ground in leaking leather tents in forests that wanted to kill them. Men who were afraid in the dark and did not have a word for what they were feeling. Men who wrote to their mothers and asked for socks. The empire was the abstraction. The tent was the reality. And the tent is what lasted. In the end, not the marble. The memory of the tent, the human fact of it, is what survives in the documents, and the letters, and the papyri that managed to escape the oblivion that took everything else. It survives because someone thought it was worth writing down, even in the dark, even on a wax tablet that was never meant to last 2,000 years. History keeps what it keeps by accident. What it kept, here, was the sound of 8 men breathing in the dark. This has been Echoes of Suff. Ring. We go to the places that history left dark, and we stay there long enough to understand what it felt like. If this story reached something in you, if the human reality of it left a mark, then you know what this channel is for. Subscribe, because the echoes are endless, and you've only just begun to hear them.